It is still a 2-point lead, 4-2 now. And Magnus Carlsen, as Magnus Carlsen does, he's looking disinterested while playing amazing chess.
Completely disinterested. He seems to be shaking his head every time he wins a game. I feel like that's something great sports players and athletes do. I've seen Steph Curry do this after he hits his 6-3 in a row because he's 6 of 7 and not 7 of 7. That's kind of what Magnus is doing in the Gukesh interview. He's never satisfied unless he plays perfectly.
I'm also glad we got our first unnecessary Steph Curry reference of the day. No Jimmy Garoppolo this time because Brock Purdy's leading those 49ers in the playoffs. So I got you covered. I know your Bay Area sports teams. I got it for you. But right now, you're going to have to fill me in because C5, striking in the center, the bishop on G7, pinning the pawn on D4 because the bishop on B2 is loose behind it. I kind of like this setup for Maxime. I think this is a big improvement over what we saw in the early set of games.
It is, and I think this is more in the spirit of the Grunfeld. In the Grunfeld, your pawn doesn't normally appear on c6. You try to play c5 in one fell swoop. So the knight's going to come out to c6, and before you know it, there's going to be major pressure on the d4 pawn. I think this is the way to solve the opening problems, and I always love it, Robert, when the players actually look at openings during the break. It shows you how seriously they take the match, and it just adds another element to these already epic duels.
That was the most impressive swoop I've seen since Cheryl swoop. So good job by you there. And right now, I feel like there is pressure mounting against white center. And Magnus, he's spending a lot of time. Right? Most of these games, it feels like he's down for like 30 seconds, a minute quite early. I wonder how that's going to be when we get to the shorter time controls, but we still have 27 minutes of 5+1. And he goes knight to e5. And now knight c6 is played. There's a lot of tension in the center between the knights.
And you could play very positionally. You could trade both pairs of knights and say that you've damaged black's structure. He takes on e4 first. So let's see how he follows up against bishop takes e4. Something's giving MBL cold feet. What is it? Is he thinking about DE?
I guess he might be, but what is the problem with bishop takes e4? That's the question you ask, and well, he answers there is none, but he took a little bit of time to figure it out.
There is the move g4. I've seen that idea before, but black can just respond with g5, carving out an escape square for the bishop. So my guess is Magnus is playing conservatively with c3 or maybe even c4.
So if there's a trade on d4 and white gets to take back with a bishop, I feel like that could be very pleasant for him. So even a move like rook c1 comes to mind, just offering some trades on the d4 square. You'll eventually play c4 and take over the newly compromised dark squares on the queen side. That said, I really like your idea to play c3 because you force black's hand. And the same holds true. If c3, you take on d4, Magnus plays your move. If cd4, is he going to play e takes d4 and keep the c6 pawn backwards? Or is he take back with the c pawn and claim that I have a healthy center and a rook coming to c1?
And if we can pull up an analysis board, I think he is going to, play CD. I'll show this quickly. I promise I'll be quick. CD, CD, C5 looks good for black, but if you actually follow the line through to its conclusion, what you notice is that white gets this massive, and not massive in terms of numbers, massive in terms of importance, the pawn majority on the queen side. It's very easy to convert this into a passed pawn, and black is in big trouble in a position like this, even if it's quote-unquote only 0.6. In any case, Maxime goes queen a5, back to the live board we go, and Magnus responds by dropping the pawn up to a4. Interesting choice by Carlsen. What do you make of this?
He wants some bishop a3 ideas. So the rook now defends the a3 square. So in the event of a capture on c5, you had bishop a3. But now, after cd4, if we get c takes d4 and c5, the one bad news for white is that the pawns on a4 and b3, they're harder to push. So look at that. Intermezzo plays b4. If the queen goes to b6, now if you play c takes d4, queen takes b4, bishop a3 looks like it may win a pawn, but e7 can be defended. So he just keeps pushing pawns, Danya. He's throwing them all up the board. And if you can't play cd4, he does.
I guess you can.
Bishop a3 is going to queen b7.
Queen b7?
And this is what Magnus does.
I guess queen a4.
For play. Yeah, he's like, have your extra pawn. Good for you.
Maybe throw an a6 to freeze the pawn on a7, situate the bishop on c5. And these are the decisions, I've used this phrase a lot thus far, these are the decisions we take for granted. Just a seamlessly interwoven positional pawn sack that gives him really nice practical play. But this is where I think MBL's extra 90 seconds can really come in handy.
And will Magnus push this pawn to a6, cementing a7 in place? What Maxime needs to do is swing his rook away from f8 and play e5. He wants to open up the position and get his bishop, his dark square bishop, into play. Look at the queen side. White can put a bishop on c5, and the bishop on e2 is already staring down to the a6 square. The bishop on e4 and the bishop on g7 not helping out. So White has the advantage on the queen side despite being down a pawn. So if Black can neutralize that activity, then the extra pawn will make its presence felt.
Great insight there. And on the basis of that, I was going to say, move the rook away from c8, prepare a quick e5 strike. And if you're Magnus Carlsen, what's your priority? Are you trying to prevent e5? If so, you consider a move like queen c3. Or do you say, I don't care about e5 because e5 doesn't actually create any threats? Well, as you mentioned, what it does is it allows the dark squared bishop to re-enter society and for Black to create a target on d4. a6 by Carlsen, and it looks like he'll follow up with bishop c5, if I had to guess.
Yeah, and the rook on f1 can go over to c1, and you're just saying your pawn on c6 is a backwards pawn, cannot move. And he goes queen c7. I think it's clear. e5 is on the docket. And maybe White will play f4 at some point.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Whoa, Magnus
F4.
with some fireworks preventing e5.
Oh, and he couldn't play bishop d7 because the e7 pawn was hanging. Or at least that was maybe one of the thoughts.
I guess bishop takes g4 there could have been considered. Maybe bishop d7 is what MVL should have played, because now without e5, Magnus essentially has a free hand on the queen side. But look at MVL.
Wait,
he's not going
takes
gentle
h5.
into that good night.
Take that pawn and maybe even play f4.
King H. Oh, and suddenly Black's the one who's suffering on the king side, is what you're saying.
Yeah, no, this looks like Magnus is playing first on the queen side, the a7 pawn. What? I'm shocked by this.
Yeah, he's leaving himself with a terrible bishop.
That's the problem, and this is what Magnus Carlsen is doing. He gives up material for piece activity. You can't necessarily quantify how valuable the activity is, but here we see the eval bar say +2 after the move e5.
No, but here you can just take and even go with a simple move like queen g2. e5 in and of itself does not carry a threat. I feel like MVL has completely lost the thread of the game here.
He has, and you can even take on g6, right, to just hurt Black's kingside position. You can take on f5 first, as you're mentioning. There's also some merit to move e3 to e4 in some positions. So a lot going on here, but you need to be careful. If you're Magnus, look at the clock. You're down to nearly 50 seconds. Maxime is over 2.5 minutes. So if a mistake happens, it's likely going to be due to time trouble.
But I think you made a fantastic prediction. HG first to clear as much space as possible on the king side. The game is far from over, but the long-term problem for MVL is this dreadfully weak a7 pawn that's straining his resources so much. The queen on f7 is going to be so close to being overextended, and maybe Carlsen will lift his queen to g4 and just keep tightening the noose on Black's position.
I love queen g4 because it threatens rook b7.
Does he want f4, f5 or something?
He can go for that. He does. Bishop back to g7. That stops the potency of f5 because it's no longer a pin. But queen g4 still looks very promising because it threatens rook b7, a huge threat.
Oh, what a move. And rook takes b7. You pick up the c8 rook with check, and then the b7 rook. He's got to move the rook away from c8, and he does. But now f5 looks good.
Oh, it's very powerful.
Oh,
rook takes
f5
f5
now. Crashing, smashing through on the king side. It's over. Bishop d4 coming, rook g5 coming. He's collapsing on all sides.
And queen e6 allows rook f8 check. You don't want to put the queen on the same diagonal as the other. So where does your queen go? Over to c7. That's away from your king and moves like rook g5, bishop d4, queen e6 check in the future. It feels like the Black king does not have any defense.
Black just has a couple of spy checks, but they lead absolutely nowhere. White's king can hide away on h3. Just a tropical island. It's got its pina colada. And Black's days are numbered.
Yes, because queen c7 is like rook f8 check with a checkmate. Oh, here it comes.
Beautiful.
That exact checkmate.
Mate in how many moves? You can play queen h5 and rook f7 and win the queen, and Magnus is probably going to do that.